I want to say that for us in World Vision, the face of climate change is different to what probably is in the public mind. In the public mind, it's a seal on a shrinking piece of ice. For us, the face of climate change is an African child. The impact that climate change is already having on lives and livelihoods, it is already a moral and humanitarian cause. We see from the 100 countries where we work, though our field staff aren't scientists, that they are repeating the same refrain over and over again. In Harare and Nairobi, built above the mosquito line, therefore without mosquitoes and without malaria, now with malaria. It's nearly 1 million Africans that die in sub-Saharan Africa from malaria each year. Malaria creeping also into the highlands of New Guinea, built above the mosquito line. The stories of our work in India, where farmers may not have any word for climate change, but they say the birds always arrived at this time of year. For as long as we have farmed and can remember, that's how we knew when to plant our seed. Those birds aren't arriving. The seasons have changed. The fertility and the crops we are getting have changed. For us, this has been an evolution to saying the environment, which actually is the incubator for all that we do and how we live, is already starting to be under such stress that a humanitarian problem has emerged. So our journey is like many other NGOs. You begin as a straightforward charity, and like the Save the Children's, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam's World Vision started as a compassionate response to tragedy. A response to tragedy born in war. Most of those organisations started like that, even the Red Cross. In 1859, a response to the war for Italian unity. Nothing wrong with charity. Charity is a specific form of love. The world needs more of it, not less. I'm not one who disdains charity. But experience over time for all these NGOs has shown that charity, in the narrow sense of providing material support to people in crisis, was necessary, important, but not enough. Not enough to produce the sustainable change in people's lives, to lift them sustainably out of poverty, to empower them. So we moved on to community development, recognising that for positive change to endure, it had to be owned by the community. As Amartya Sen puts it powerfully, for communities to name their future, what is the good life as they define it, not as we define it. Not saying often in development terms, the developing world has a problem. It's called poverty. The developed world has the solution. It's called wealth. If we just give them some of our wealth, they won't have a problem. Recognizing that we all have a problem. And I come back from parts of the world where I would never, ever romanticize poverty, but I see kids kicking a Coke bottle having more fun than kids with iPods and every electronic gadget here, where there's still connection to land and story and song and celebration. And in Australia, where we've solved the problem of supply, we've solved the problem of how many mobile telephones a 16-year-old teenage girl needs. We have solved that massive dilemma. Or how many widescreen TVs a family home needs. I come back and I see an epidemic often of depression. Drug abuse rates that are unacceptably high. Youth suicide rates unacceptably high. And you start to go, this isn't simply about we have the answer and charity can give them the solution to their problem as we have named it. We all are in this together. My favourite BBC documentary was a group of Indian slum dwellers taken from the Basti to London, and I've spent 2 nights in a slum in New Delhi. The humidity, the stench, the noise, the distance to walk to get clean water, and it's not water I can drink, was absolutely overwhelming and intolerable. I know a little bit, just for a couple of nights, of that poverty. These Basti dwellers are taken to London. They meet families and community groups and are taken on the sites. And they're interviewed afterwards about their experience. It's amazing to listen to what they say. They say, these people in London are so lonely, so isolated. They have so few spiritual resources. They have so little community. At the end, they said, we have to do something to help these poor people. It's terrific. But it reminds us that our perceptions of reality, particularly based around charity, aren't sufficient. Development is actually partnership and community, which is exactly the challenge of climate change. So while our core business remains to provide assistance to people in emergencies, it's also our core business to develop programs that are sustainable to support communities around the world as they work for a just future. And now it's particularly advocacy around the massive challenge of climate change, undermining, washing away the foundation of them achieving that. So we do not lose sight of the individual person, the individual child at the heart of our work, so vulnerable and so full of promise. But we remember that if we are to be addressing causes, then advocacy around climate change is fundamentally important, as it is with some other global forces, that the world literally is a waterbed. You press down here, it comes up here. Some people get sick. In Mexico last year, we closed schools here in Melbourne, a swine flu epidemic. Some banks with funny names, well, I thought they were funny. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got into trouble, and banks all around the world are suddenly in trouble. This profound interdependence. If we in Australia think that we can pull up the drawbridge and protect ourselves if we lose more of the Indonesian forest and the Amazonian forest, we have failed to see the profound interdependence of the world as a global village. We must truly have a world vision. We must have a deep responsibility to speak out on issues that threaten all of us. Climate change is really that foremost issue. It threatens to undo 60 years of development work, to pull away like a rug from under our feet the progress, the gains that we have made. There is no more pressing issue. Well, you know, you've heard in these lectures what we have done to our world. Human society is outgrowing its environmental support system through an ever-increasing demand for resources and the production of waste and pollution. Economic growth has taken billions from poverty to prosperity, including here in Australia. Just think about your great-grandparents. But where once we sought sufficiency, we now see consumer behaviour is literally costing us the earth. Most of that damaging climate change has been caused by the drive to extreme wealth by industrialised countries. The explosive growth of the new emerging economies now threatens to make that situation even more critical. But let's be honest, over 2 centuries, we in the industrialised West failed to price carbon. Without those price signals, that massive market failure, much economic development in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, transport has been carried out unsustainably. We now know this. We now are facing the cost of this. The reckoning day is here. And we are facing this awful decision: can we pay the price? I know in Australia we have gone back on the climate change debate. We wish we were back in 2007 when there was actually vision and naming of the issue. I understand how within all of us, and it's true of me, deep psychologically within the inner recesses of my life, I just don't want to believe climate change is true. And when I feel like that, and someone takes those whispers in my psychology and amplifies it, as has the Nick Minchins, and then the Tony Abbotts, and the campaign that goes on, that megaphone takes and amplifies the deep whisper of disbelief, not wanting to believe it within me, and we see some of the mess of this debate now. Can we, will we pay the price? Will we face up to what we know is true, even though deep down we still want to deny it? Well-belated efforts to change the basis of whole industries, of national economies, is politically fraught. It's a challenge that must be faced. I was in Copenhagen at an event Tim was running, and Tim will remember those committed CEOs and business leaders just being asked, who's prepared to pay 10% extra for your electricity? Most hands were up. Who will pay 20% more? At least half the hands went down. 25% more. Most hands were down. These were people who believed. We see the political difficulties of paying the price, saying, surely, not that price. Maybe it isn't true. Maybe there's another way. But we now have to face this challenge. As a species, we've become addicted to burning fossil fuels. An addiction that's still growing. And Australia's not a minor player in this drama. Australia has itself among the highest per capita carbon emissions. Beyond this, Australia's thermal coal supports cheap and dirty electricity in many countries. This is partly our mess, even though those emissions we've exported are counted elsewhere. It's partly our mess. Our exports generate 750 million tonnes of CO2 each year. As the industry plans to double exports by 2020, Australia will overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's #1 carbon exporter. We are up to our necks in this. And the argument that we only produce 1.5% or whatever it is of the overall carbon emissions isn't a defence. Given that there are at least 200 nations in the world, imagine if they all produce 1.5%. We are up to this to our necks. There is no defence. Although these truths are well known and millions of words have poured forth from every quarter, it seems, psychologically and politically, and in our imagination of the world as a world village, a global village, we can't face up to what climate change means. I'm here tonight to say that its impacts on the poorest, who have contributed the least there, are already disproportionate, unfair, and the heaviest, and that's why this is a moral challenge for us. We have to face some very painful moral choices and our own complicity. Well, climate change is affecting the developing world in lots of ways. You know something about the disasters, though there's still argument about the extent to which climate change influences natural disasters. While we can't precisely, without some percentage of question, pinpoint any particular weather event and say, well, that's one's due to climate change, most of the studies overwhelmingly point in one direction. Floods, typhoons, cyclones will be more intense and more frequent, seasons more unpredictable, droughts longer. You've heard what the 40,000 staff in 100 countries that World Vision works in are all saying and observing. Yes, not scientists, maybe anecdotal, but overwhelming in what they are saying. Well, the evidence, I believe, is unequivocally clear enough to make our obligations clear. It's imperative that we work to reduce disaster risk. Our own region is a disaster hotspot. We are a long way, Europe and America is a long way from the world's poor. We happen to be in the region where most of the world's poor live. Professor Muhammad Yunus, who I did a speaking tour with 3 months ago here in Australia, an extraordinary man, a hero of mine, Grameen Bank, Nobel Prize, you know some of his work. He said, Bangladesh, the sea levels are rising 1/4 of a centimetre each year. He said, where do you think tens of thousands of Bangladeshis, if we don't address this, are going to be headed? And I commented, and yes, aren't we in Australia just so mature with a few boats just arriving at the moment? Well, in this region, we see the hotspots, the Asia-Pacific rim of eruption. Cyclones, climate change, though not always, certainly not being the cause for earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, only intensifies the challenge. When the world responds, when calamity strikes out of common humanity and dignity, not out of our own interests, you see the best of our instincts, and you have a momentary hope that the world will, with that instinct, not lurch into instability and crisis, that it might face up to the challenges. But the question is, will we choose to invest more now? Partnering with communities in disaster preparedness, helping them adapt to changed climate, or do we just, because we won't pay the price, leave it to the next generation? They can be the rescue generation. They will be left the bill funding ever-expanding relief efforts. For the poorest countries, they're already experiencing the exposure to climate change. They're already living in vulnerable circumstances. The families that I visit are living on crumbling riverbanks or steep hillsides, unproductive land, on floodplains, where tenure is desperately fragile, where the impacts of wild weather is worse and huge. For us, a drought until it's 3 years in, we're still coping and feeding ourselves. 3 months of a drought in these vulnerable, poor communities is enough to wipe them out. There isn't the disaster resilience and preparedness. Last year, within a few weeks of the disasters in Samoa, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India, I visited some of those places. I was struck by how the environmental degradation makes the impact so much harder when disasters hit. And if I had a graph and I could show you disasters over the last 10 years, you'd see just the quantum jump in the number of disasters occurring. Whilst climate change doesn't cause earthquakes, that degradation makes the impact so much harder to respond to an earthquake in some of the places I visited. 2 years ago, I was in Burma. I was lucky to get in. They weren't giving out visas. They said, we've got it under control. When Cyclone Nargis killed 130,000 people, when it, in an unprecedented way, never in Burmese history had this happened, went 25 kilometres inland. I was lucky to get in because I hassled the Department of Foreign Affairs for the Burmese ambassador's mobile phone number and got it. I rang him. I said, my name's Tim Costello. There was a silence, and he said, oh, Tim Costello, I've seen you on TV. I thought, this is promising. I said, we've got 800 staff there. They've lost loved ones. I need to get up there. No, no, no. The government's got it under control. We don't need outside help. I said, I need to get there. My staff need me there. They're in trauma. And then he repeated, I've seen you on TV quite a lot. Thankfully, B-grade minor celebrity got me a visa. I remember doing CNN and BBC and other interviews and being quite amused, though it was scary, that the journalists who'd all gone on tourist visas would come with hats and false moustaches and interview me in different places. Every time their report went to air, they got thrown out. I was waiting to see if I was going to get thrown out. But in all of that political difficulty and that horror, what struck me most was how Burmese people said, this is unbelievable. And I said, but you're in a region of cyclones. They said, this is unbelievable. Of course we're in the region of cyclones. But cyclones always miss us and hit Bangladesh, they said. This cyclone was unprecedented. And here was a poor country with really a malevolent government responding to just extraordinary tragedy. Well, again and again I've witnessed the incredible devastation, the human loss, people saying it's unprecedented, knowing that the two things that can help, improving health resources and building local economic resilience, so that sudden shocks mean that families at least have some resources. Preparing communities from the risks of flooding, storms and droughts. A warming world makes reducing risk, raising resilience, profoundly core work indispensable work for us. At World Vision, we estimate that the cost of our relief operations, which cuts into our ability to invest in long-term sustainable development work, has already risen significantly, and in the next 10 years will rise again. It will go, we believe, from, in 2008, spending $90 million in relief spending to what we estimate a figure of $644 million. As a proportion of World Vision's costs, up 35%. By 2020, our analysis, future analysis, says at current trends, we will be spending 60% of our funds that should be going into development. That's nearly $3 billion a year just on emergency relief. And there's no question why. Because of climate change. The massive shift from being a development organisation to being a relief organisation in terms of our future preparedness because of climate change. If I had time, I would take you through the ways we're seeking to refit our community development programs that last 12 to 15 years. After that time, we've said at the start, you know, we will be leaving and the money will be stopping. And we work across all the sectors here so you can be lifted to sustainability, choosing your future as you name it. But now that development model has to have extraordinary spend because of the pressure of climate change. In the Quang Nye province of Vietnam, we partner with 10 communities, diversifying farmers' incomes, educating farmers about emergencies, preparing resilience and warning systems. Time doesn't allow me to go into all the adaptation measures, but for us, finance for adaptation, to prepare communities from these severe storms, longer droughts, more tropical disease, shouldn't be at the expense of existing overseas development aid, at the expense of AusAid. Simply substituting development funds now for climate change funds isn't right, isn't going to help us achieve the Millennium Development Goals. But it means that the one achievement out of Copenhagen, the Fast Start funds, 30 billion over the next 3 years, 100 billion by 2020, we know all countries, including Australia, have said, well, that payment is actually going to come out of overseas development assistance, aid. The substitution is already starting. Finally, let me just say a few brief words about food and economic development. Disasters aside, innovative responses to climate change have to focus on people's most basic needs: shelter, security, water and food. Rainfall becomes less reliable, drought ever present, and this is a huge threat to food production in many parts of the world. It is not an option simply to abandon these lands to agriculture. Hundreds of millions of people rely on subsistence farming. In the short term, drought-induced famines can be relieved by emergency response, but still at the cost of many deaths and enormous hardship. But, as we've found over the past decade here in Australia, the real question is, when does an emergency really become the new normal? Climate change is transforming emergencies into the existing, ongoing paradigm of normal. In poor countries, even a short but severe drought, as I've mentioned, has massive consequences. Subsistence farmers can't simply tough out some bad years like farmers here in Australia can. One lost crop means hunger and malnutrition. It means taking their children out of school. It means literally falling victim to debt bondage and selling kids who work for some landlord, maybe in a rice mill or sewing wedding dresses, for often the rest of their lives to pay off the loan the farmer took to feed the other kids. These are the human faces of climate change. Last year in Western India, it experienced its driest rainy season for 40 years. Dramatic drops in food production sent prices of rice, corn, wheat all soaring. When the monsoons came, they came late. They came in unexpected places. They caused great damage and floods. At the same time, some parts of Mumbai, a mega city with nearly 25 million people, came perilously close to running out of drinking water. These disasters was a wake-up call for the Indian government as to the perils of climate change. Right now, where we work in large parts of Thailand, Vietnam and the Philippines, they're going through a similar dry period. We have to ask whether the climate that has so long supported so much life in Asia, which is our neighbourhood, can go on, will go on doing so in the future. In terms of economic development, it's a very simple point I make. We have no right to consign people in poorer countries to permanent poverty and injustice. Climate change is the moral imperative for global peace and justice, for the opportunity for everyone in the world to enjoy freedom from fear and freedom from want, the opportunity to live a good life as they themselves understand it. That doesn't imply everyone will follow, let's hope they don't, the Western or any particular model of economic or political development. But it certainly suggests there are common values and aspirations that humanity broadly shares. The good news is we have made some progress. Some very simple interventions, like rehydration kits that have massively reduced child deaths from diarrhea, bed nets that are proving effective in combating malaria. More people now have access to clean water through much better sanitation, to adequate food. As a chair of Make Poverty History, people often smile at those three words as if Make Poverty History is only for idealists who haven't grown out of adolescence, who somehow think this could actually be achieved. They smile when they hear the names of Bono and Bob Geldof associated with it and say, well, what do you expect? Always remember they are Irish. They're Irish singers. They're romantics. You never can deal with poverty. But through some of the simple interventions I've just named, we have seen the number of children dying reduced from 20 years ago, 60,000 kids a day, to 2 years ago, 30,000 kids dying a day, to today, 2 years later, 24,000 kids dying a day. Still obscene with the wealth in the world. But there is a march, and that march has been because of some very simple interventions by the commitment of nations to the Millennium Development Goals. But as I've said, climate change can undo all of those achievements, undo this development progress. So, as our global pattern of life has already pushed the limits of our resources, in the rich world, where we see greater energy use, more travel, more complex diets, the demand for ever bigger houses, often in emerging economies, them aspiring to the same, climate change becomes the amplifier of these trends. The fact that now 50% of the world is urbanized, part of it driven by the loss of arable land and need. Climate change amplifies every other economic and development challenge we've got. In economic development, we know the answers. Developing countries need to grow. They will grow. The only question is, will it be a low-carbon growth or a pattern like ours? If we are to avoid the high-carbon growth, they will need technologies. Technologies and transfer of technologies to bring about the improvements they deserve and demand in living standards and health, in stimulating local manufacturing, to leapfrog the high carbon phase that we nations who have done the damage have for the last 200 years modelled. But small-scale technologies aren't the only solution. Technical innovation, significant technology transfer, significant funding of climate change without just pinching it from overseas aid is the practical action that's desperately needed. And alongside it, the personal action of all of us thinking of the bigger picture and acting, and of course, the policy action. Global action on emissions, the pricing of carbon, to reduce emissions, and to address adaptation and mitigation with climate finance. Here in Australia, the nation of all developed nations most affected, we appear to be competing to be the laggard, the last to the table, not the leader, when we are in the region where we have most of the world's poor and are the nation most affected. On climate financing, the Australian government has plenty of opportunity now to show some good faith, making a substantial down payment on solidarity. And the pictures that are in my mind, the pictures of the African and Asian child, the pictures of how the world as a global village has one pie to divide up, or another picture, who owns the sky, who has the right to put the most up there for their lifestyle, now has to be dealt with on equity grounds globally. I'll never forget being at a birthday party. I had my son there. The happy birthday song was sung, the candles whipped out. The mum started cutting up the cake, and I remember an American mum, and I'm sure this is not true of all Americans, but she was puzzled. She said, "What are you doing?" to the Australian mum. She said, "Oh, this is our practice, our culture. After the party, we cut up the cake, and each kid gets a piece. They can eat it now and take it home." And the American mum said, "Well, that's not fair." And the Australian mum said, "What do you mean it's not fair? Every kid gets a piece. And it's basically the same size piece. It couldn't be fairer." She said, "Well, it's not fair because you've just decided for the kids. You haven't asked them if they want a piece. Some may not want a piece. Some may want a bigger piece. You've given them no say. Who are you just to decide?" I was a bit surprised. I was thinking about that as Obama had to push through with his health bill. With the health cake, 40 million Americans didn't even have a piece. And the others said, absolutely no way. It is socialism to tax us a little bit more to give them a piece. Amartya Sen, and I'll finish with this, in his book, The Idea of Justice, actually talks about the challenges of different strands of justice. He says, imagine 3 kids fighting over a flute. The first kid says, "I deserve the flute because I'm the only one that can play it." The other kids admit that's right. The second one says, "Well, I deserve the flute. I'm really poor. I have absolutely no toys. If I had the flute, it would be my only toy." The others admit he's got no toys. The third child says, "Well, I deserve the flute because I'm the one who've actually made the flute. And just as I finish making it, these others turn up wanting it." He says in strands of justice, the person who's the utilitarian actually says, well, the person who can play the flute will get the most happiness and pleasure and bring pleasure to the most of the others. Utilitarian ethics, of course that person gets the flute. The economic egalitarian says, but this kid has no toys. This is his chance for a toy. And of course, the libertarian, John Stuart Mill, says, well, who made it? It's interesting when you think about our super profits mining tax in this context. The utilitarian says, leave it in the ground, it's non-renewable, Australia's population will be bigger later, slow it down, we'll all benefit, there'll be more people to benefit. The economic egalitarian, which is really the Rudd argument, says, but businesses can get a tax cut now. Small businesses, not mining companies. And we can all get more super. We all get a slice of the cake. And of course the mining companies, with the libertarian argument, say, well, we invested, we explored, we put the money in, it's ours. How dare you? Justice is complex. For mine, when we think about who owns the sky on climate change, only a per capita basis of talking about emissions seems to me to be the way to find an ethic that picks up what has to be an economic egalitarian argument. My friend in World Vision, Dave Young, tells the story, and with this I finish, of being in Africa when he was young. Going 2 hours out of a city on the back of a truck, bouncing along because African roads have potholes big enough to swallow trucks. Screeching to a halt, a massive tree across the road, thick bush on either side, nowhere to get around, and one lone African with a tomahawk chipping away futilely. And A truck comes the other way, sees the same problem, pulls up. They agree the only solution is chains. They get the chains out of the truck, they back the truck up, but then the trunk is so massive they can't get the chains around. They say, what's the solution? It can only be human effort. So they literally all put their shoulders to the trunk, and on 3 they heave. This trunk is so massive, such a dead weight, it doesn't shudder. More people start appearing out of the bush. It's an African experience. You're thinking you're in a remote place, no one lives there. Suddenly people just start appearing. They put their shoulders, they heave, it shudders, but it doesn't move. They're about to give up, and someone says, one last go before the bone-jarring 2-hour trip back to the city. Let's not die wondering. Dave remembers putting his shoulder to the trunk one last time. He remembers because this frail, elderly African man who'd come out of the bush snuggled in next to him. He remembers this because he remembers looking at him and thinking, fat lot of good you're going to do. This African man starts to sing. It's an African song. Dave doesn't know it, the Africans do. As they're singing, they are obviously waiting till it builds up and hits a crescendo. When it hits a particular part of the song, they all know to heave. And they heave, and this trunk moves an inch. They take a breather, shoulders again. He starts singing. Dave's waiting this time. They hit the note, they heave. It moves another inch. They sung and heaved 30, 40 times until they'd moved the trunk just enough for the trucks to get around. Dave said, in my future as a consultant, it was the most important lesson. He said the mission never changed. The mission was to move this massive trunk. We all knew the mission. He said the strategy never changed. It couldn't be tomahawk. It couldn't be chains. It could only be, as a strategy, human effort. So what changed? What changed was a frail, elderly African man's song that reached into their hearts, that drew out something they didn't know was there, that wasn't there before, that got them into alignment, and there was energy that wasn't there before. On climate change, we need a song in a global village that gets us into alignment because we are in this together, that understands the humanitarian and the personal imperatives. Thank you.